Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's live chat, and thank you for joining us for what promises to be a truly insightful conversation. South Africa stands at crossroads in 2025, facing rising unemployment, ongoing energy and water crisis, political uncertainty, and a growing demand for ethical leadership. Amid all this, the national dialogue has emerged as a beacon of hope, a chance for the nation to confront its challenges through open discussion and collective action. Joining us today is Ismail Joosub, a respected voice in public affairs and community engagement. We'll be exploring his recent conversation with former President Thabo Mbeki and unpacking what the national dialogue really means for South Africa's future. We'll also be touching on the most pressing issues shaping the nation, from corruption and crime to economic recovery, youth unemployment, and climate resilience. How are you, Ismail?
I'm well, Siddharth. How are you? It's been a long time
I'm
since we.
Yeah, you're right, man. It's been too long. But I caught up with your friend Ezra, I think a few weeks ago. So it'll be nice to have two of you all in within 3 weeks.
I just want to say how proud I am of Ezra Mendel. Ezra was an intern of mine at the FW de Klerk Foundation, so I'd like to think I played some small but significant role in his development. There's so much that he teaches me that I learn from him. You mentioned
Wow.
ethical leadership. I don't think there's a better epitome of ethical leadership than Ezra. So very happy that you got to chat to him. I'm sure he must have exuded a lot of great insights on your chat. And keep it
Mhm.
up. Keep up your podcast as well. You're making a significant impact in the podcast space. I've been following your podcast for a long time. You've had conversations with really impactful people like Rob Hersoff. So you're doing great too, Siddharth.
Thanks, man. All right. Let's get into the national dialogue side. What is the true intention behind the national dialogue, and how can it move beyond talk to become a platform for real, implementable change in South Africa?
I love the question because it's a question I've answered on the media so much. Let's break it up into different components. What is the national dialogue, and why was there meant to be a national dialogue in the first place? Now, I want you to take you back into history. We live in a country, we live in South Africa that currently is at a crossroads, right? I mean, South Africa today has an unemployment rate that's spiraling, 33%. We've got a youth unemployment rate that's perhaps even worse at 46%. But we've got systemic issues as well. We don't have the ethical leaders that you mentioned. And when we question why that is, we see that it's probably because we don't have the right electoral system. When
Hmm.
people are elected to parliament, when people are elected to become public officials or public office bearers, they're elected via a political party proportional system, and they pander more to political party bosses really than to the electorate themselves. So our electoral system is a mess. Our judiciary is also a mess. I mean, if you look at the NPA, the National Prosecuting Authority, and you see how low they've sunk in terms of prosecutions, how lagging behind our judiciary is in terms of prosecuting the bad guys. So the judiciary is a problem. If you look at, for instance, the police system in South Africa, I mean, we've seen now with General Mkhwanazi and with the Matlanga Commission, the allegations that have been made of capture, state capture via criminal syndicates. So that's a problem as well. So there are a number of problems in South Africa, not to mention our fragmented social fabric. I mean, when you look at the ideal or the dream of what was once known as a rainbow nation, you have to ask yourself whether that dream is still kept alive. After 1994, South Africans believed in this promise of a rainbow nation, that we can come together despite our differences, that we can come together in spite of our different religions and creeds and colors and backgrounds, and work together towards a common agenda, a common goal of building South Africa. And it seems to me, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that we've retreated now into our various quarters. You've got the colored vote, uh, people and parties like the Patriotic Alliance appeal to that. You've got the Indian or Muslim vote. You've got the white vote. You've got the majority, and the black vote is split up between the middle class and the more leftists. So we fragmented as a society. We're lacking social cohesion, and reconciliation is still a long way away. I mention all of these things because that comes then to the realization that if we don't have a national dialogue, firstly to get people talking, and there's nothing wrong with talking, then we will certainly fight. The national dialogue, therefore, Siddharth, is a last resort of means to stop us from falling into the abyss, to stop us from seeing an Arab Spring situation the way you saw in the Arab world in 2011. And we've had a number of national dialogues in the past in South Africa that have been tremendously successful. If you look at 1955 and you look at the Freedom Charter essentially laid down the basic framework for what would then become the Constitution. A constitution, its process, CODESA, the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, in and of itself was a dialogue, a national dialogue, because it appealed to all sectors of society to come together and reshape the way South Africa defines itself, for itself, by itself, for the people of South Africa. We've had a number of other dialogues. We've had the National Peace Accord that in 1991-92, Bobby Gottsell, Cyril Ramaphosa, and others were a part of to lay that framework for CODESA. So South Africans are known for talking. You asked what will stop it from just becoming another talk shop. This is where it gets important. Now let me speak about the actual implementation and the execution of what was to have been the national dialogue. The national dialogue in its current form has been distorted, has been hijacked, it's in the process of being collapsed. But when we were leading this national dialogue initiative, of course, we envisaged it to be something implementable and executable to bring about real life change for the people of South Africa. Now, it's one thing to talk, and I mentioned already there's nothing wrong with talking, but then to reconcile all of these solutions that emerge from our conversation and take that to Parliament in the form of binding legislation. Take that to the various sectors of society to make sure that sectors implement it. Let me give you a practical example. The mining industry is fragmented as well. Now, the mining industry or the mining sector forms one of the sectors of the national dialogue, right? Big mining, goldfields, JSI, Anglo-American, and so forth. The way we envisage a national dialogue really is to go to these industry leaders, but also to go to the people on the ground, your normal, everyday, average miners, and ask them, what are some of the problems in the mining sector? What would you like to see changed? In other words, what are the solutions, for instance, to mining in South Africa? And they might say X, Y, Z. They might say, we don't like the fact that the state vests control over mineral resources in itself. We prefer a more decentralized model. They might say we don't like the wages that we're getting. They might say we don't like this issue of zama-zamas. And then what we do is we go to the industry leaders and we say, industry leaders, you've got tremendous influence in the mining sector. These are some of the problems, but some of the recommended solutions that we think you should implement. Please go ahead and implement. If that doesn't work, you go to Parliament. And I don't think there's any political party in South Africa who, notwithstanding the voice of the people, would go against the grain and say we don't support the views of the people and we're not going to implement those solutions that emerge from the national dialogue. So that was the national dialogue. And the third big component for me for the national dialogue was to instill a sense of civic education in young people, especially. Siddharth, you and I are both young people in South Africa. I am shocked, I'm disheartened, I'm dismayed, disappointed really by the fact that young people in South Africa have tapped out of not just a political system, but of political consciousness. We relegate politics to older people. We relegate politics as young people to members of parliament, to ward councillors who, quite frankly, don't do their job. We've become complacent about the situation. And in complacency, what we've done is we've seemed to have adopted this dependency or entitlement mindset that somebody will do something for me, somebody will fund my business, somebody will send me to university for free, somebody will pay for X for free. That's the idea of the national dialogue. 13,000 community dialogues. Every single ward in South Africa would have had a community dialogue. And these community dialogues could be as little as 50 or 20 people, ranging up to the thousands of people. You need trained facilitators. You need people who are there to cater logistics. You need people who buy into the process. You need people who market the process, communicate the process well. A massive endeavor. An endeavor so big that it was envisioned that it would cost somewhere in the range of 700 million rand. Though I must debunk that figure, let me stop there.
All right. Okay, let's get to the insights with from Thabo Mbeki. In your conversation with former President Thabo Mbeki, what were his main reflections on South Africa current political and social climate?
Okay. So President Thabo Mbeki is a well-respected leader who's touted his African Renaissance project for a long time. He's somebody who has my deepest admiration. I've been involved with the Thabo Mbeki Foundation for a long time. I've been involved with them, uh, I'd say perhaps for the past 4 or 5 years. And so when you refer to this conversation that we had with Thabo Mbeki, it was essentially a gathering, not just with me, but with young people across South Africa to speak about some of the most pressing social, economic, political, international problems facing South Africa. Some of the things that stood out is that South Africa cannot see itself as uh, an island in a sea of despair. There's a recognition on the part of the former president that there are massive challenges in Africa and that South Africa has a role to play in aiding these uh, countries to come together and solve their problems. South Africa itself has a lot of issues. And, we spoke about some of them in my previous answer. We spoke about unemployment. We spoke about this massive criminal issue that's going on where criminal syndicates seem to have captured government as well. It points back to the need for a national dialogue. One of the things that also stands out for me when conversing with not just people like former President Thabo Mbeki, but other leaders as well, is that we haven't empowered people and communities to do things for themselves. And because we haven't empowered communities to do things for themselves, what happens is that we get swept away by international currents. I mean, if you look at what's happening with Russia, Ukraine, if you look at what's happening with Israel, Palestine, if you look at what's happening with America and the tariffs that they've placed on us, it seems as though South Africa hasn't taken, except for Israel and Palestine, firm stances on anything, that we're being swept away by the current. And that's because we haven't empowered communities in and of themselves to come together for themselves to define who they are. And if we do that, then as a country, we'll know what we stand for, we'll defend what we stand for rigorously, and we'll be able to move forward on one national agenda. So President Thabo Mbeki often gives us very practical solutions to this. He himself is involved in a number of conflict resolution instances. I refer now to the DRC, where you've got this issue of the rebels, with the Banyamulenge and so forth, how he's helped to assist that government of that country to solve that problem. But also Madagascar, where there's conflict that's rising there, Burkina Faso, where we see Ibrahim Traore and his rise, and whether that poses challenges and risks for South Africa, or whether it's a good thing in the region. You also look at the Sahel, you look at Mali, you look at Senegal. Thabo Mbeki is very rigorously pushing this idea of a presidential library or a presidential center, and I love this idea that he's been touting through his foundation. It's essentially to get all of us together to assist him and his foundation in building a presidential center, which will house the archives of great African leaders all across the continent in Johannesburg. But to do more than that, to conscientize people, to make it fashionable once again to know about what's going on around you and how you can come together to play a role in solving these issues.
All right. Just get to the coalition government challenges. With the new government of national unity facing internal tensions, how can leaders ensure political stability while still prioritizing the needs of ordinary citizens?
It's a difficult question. Because when you look at coalitions, on the one hand, coalitions, we must realize, are an inevitability of any proper democratic system. It is impossible for any democracy to have one party that rules for infinity. And the ANC should have predicted this, because sometimes it does feel as though they think as though they're going to be ruling forever. Can't be. The coalitions, at least, on a national level, could have been predicted. And coalitions on a national level were the last form of coalition that we've had. We've already had coalitions at a local level for a number of years. Since 2016, in fact, 2006, you had a coalition in Cape Town. Now, on the other hand, recognizing that coalitions are an inevitability, one must also recognize that there are certain challenges that come with the coalition system. And the biggest challenge is the challenge of parties being able to compromise, because too few parties are able to compromise their interests for the people of South Africa, for the good of the entire country, not just for their own political party, but take a compromise on certain political stances, on policy stances. And so when you talk about the government of national unity, which isn't a government of national unity, but in fact a grand coalition, just a big coalition, 10 parties coming together in unison to try and hopefully fix South Africa's problems. When you talk about this grand coalition that we have, I don't think it's been faring all that well. And I say I don't think it's been faring all that well because there hasn't been that important compromise that was supposed to have been made by some parties. I already mentioned that the ANC thinks that they govern as though they are a ruling party or think that they are governing forever. But also on the part of other parties, I think there's been a step forward and a step back. And my overall analysis of the GNU is that it could have been far worse. Had you had the wrong parties in the mix, it could have certainly been far worse. So at least it hasn't become an igniter for South Africa to have found itself in a blaze. But on the other hand, we haven't really pushed the needle on solving some of those critical issues that we spoke about. So that's that. I'm really more concerned about coalitions at a local government level. So when you talk about coalitions, for instance, in the city of Johannesburg, or you talk about coalitions in the city of Tshwane, and especially now with the local government elections coming up, that's what I'm worried about. If you look at the city of Johannesburg and you just look at Johannesburg alone, COJ, if it stood as its own country, would still be one of the most prosperous countries in Africa. Just put that into perspective. The city of Johannesburg, if it was a country in and of itself, would have been one of the most prosperous countries in Africa. And look what we're doing with Joburg. There's no service delivery. We mess it up by allowing parties with 1 or 2 seats in council, like Kabelo Gwamanda, to come and be mayor and drive a budget of the city that's 80 or 90 billion rand. That's what I'm afraid about. And we haven't gotten the gist, I think, about how coalitions should be managed at a local government level. Perhaps legislatively, it would be better for us to consider doing things like implementing thresholds. Perhaps it would be better to maybe directly elect a mayor. I'm not exactly certain what needs to be done legislatively, but what I can say politically is that if we don't fix coalitions at a local government level, we're certainly not going to fix coalitions at a national level. Also, we've got to start rearing ourselves to have a better culture towards coalitions. Let's not view all coalitions as evil. Sometimes we get scared when we hear on the news that the DA, hypothetically, that the DA and the EFF have formed a coalition, or Action SA and the ANC have formed a coalition. I mean, these things happen. If that's not the case, you find power vacuums, and you can't have a power vacuum. So it's normal, natural that parties with very diverse views and ideologies would come together to form coalitions. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt, but let's actually hold them accountable when services are not delivered. I mean, if you look at, again, going back to the city of Johannesburg, and I apologize if my answer is too long, but the water crisis has become completely untenable, firstly. Secondly, is that there's been a culture of impunity where leaders think that they can get away with whatever they want. There's been misappropriation, in my opinion, of the budget, where funds that are supposed to have gone to fixing the water crisis are now suddenly gone to other means. And the revolving door of mayors hasn't made things better, which just gives credence to the fact that we haven't gotten the gist of coalitions. At a national level, I am, less worried and a little bit more optimistic about the government of national unity, but I still am worried nonetheless. I don't think the GNU is going to tear apart at its seams. I don't think the DA is going to be kicked out of the GNU or going to leave voluntarily. And I don't think, we're going to have what some commentators call a doomsday coalition with the MK and EFF until, at least until 2029. But regardless of the fact, that's philosophy. What we're talking about now is execution and accountability. And I'm not sure there's anything that the GNU in and of itself as a government of South Africa, because when you serve in a government, in the cabinet of South Africa, you don't serve as a DA minister, or as an ANC minister, or as an IFP minister. You serve as a minister of finance, a minister of education. And I'm not exactly sure we've moved the needle on any of these critical issues as the government, as the GNU.
All right. Getting to the economic recovery and unemployment, unemployment, especially among the youth, remains alarmingly high. What strategies should the national dialogue focus on to stimulate growth and job creation in 2025?
Yeah, look, so again, it's a misnomer perhaps to say that the national dialogue is going to be the mechanism stimulating growth, just as it is to say that the government should provide jobs. It's not the government's job to provide jobs. It's not the national dialogue's job to stimulate economic growth. What the national dialogue does really is to get people together who they themselves can stimulate growth to go back to their sectors, do what needs to be done in their sectors, which hopefully will have a ripple effect on the whole of society. And in that process, economic growth will be stimulated, right? So it's, as I said, a last resort of means for the betterment of South Africa. But just having a national dialogue is not going to solve anything. National dialogue then needs to result in something implementable and executionable. And you need people from diverse sectors to do that. So a little bit of a misnomer. But answering that question more pointedly is that I think skills development is incredibly important in South Africa. Skills development among the youth in South Africa. I think one of the conversations that must be had as well is what barriers to success are there in South Africa? That's a national dialogue part, dialoguing about barriers and obstacles to success, especially for young people in South Africa. But the actionable part then, which probably would even go outside the ambit of the national dialogue into the ambit of parliament, is what legislation needs to be changed then to allow for more growth in South Africa. And I'll give you an example of this. So Black economic empowerment, for instance. BEE is one of those policies that, in my opinion, hasn't worked. It has not only not worked, but has hindered possible economic growth in South Africa. And I mentioned Starlink and Elon Musk, which, if you look at our grade 4 learners in South Africa, right, Siddharth? We've got grade 4 learners in South Africa, 10 years old, 11 years old. 81% of these grade 4 learners can't read for meaning. Breaks my heart. When you compare that with grade 4 learners in America, in the UK, in Australia, in other more developed countries in the world who are now learning coding and AI and already starting to plot together a vision for how they think they're going to change the world in their 40s. How do we fix that problem in South Africa? You've got to understand that government can't solve all of society's ills. If it could, it would have, firstly. Secondly, is that a large part of all of these problems were created by government in the first place. The educational issue, for instance. And so it would be foolhardy for anybody to say that the very same government that was the cause of these problems should now come back in and try and solve these problems after 30 years of trying and failing. And so then we must bring in other actors. And I think the private sector should really do a lot more to come in, take up some of the burdens of government, and I'm happy to see that Operation Vulindlela is a starting means for this, and to say that in conjunction, in unison, in partnership, in collaboration with government. For instance, government could perhaps give private companies tax breaks for them, private companies taking over some of government's duties, but have the private sector come in who do things far more efficiently and solve some of these critical issues in society. An interesting stat is that 60% of South Africans have faith in the private sector, 12% of South Africans have faith in the public sector. Now, the other thing is that you've got to be very clever about it. What the national dialogue must do as well is not only to bring these challenges to the fore and the solutions to the fore, but make it savvy and fashionable for the private sector and investors to actually want to do these things, and perhaps to insinuate or suggest, and this suggestion will come not from one person or me or you, but really from the majority of South Africans who I hope actually see the light and who want South Africa to be on a better path, to say what government should perhaps do is to have tax breaks, tax grants given to companies who can come in, invest in South Africa, and open TVET colleges for skills development. Tax breaks, tax grants for companies who open factories in South Africa and who give jobs to workers in South Africa. The best thing for South Africa right now, just from a purely political perspective, if I'm to speak, is for South Africa to become the factory of Africa. And we've got economic issues, and I was going to bring it up in the previous answer, but we've got these economic issues, for instance, where the automobile companies are leaving South Africa. If you look at the crisis in the Eastern Cape, we've got an issue where ArcelorMittal, for instance, in the steel industry is leaving. We've got the agricultural sector that's also under threat. We've got the U.S. tariffs that's under threat. The National Treasury predicts that those U.S. tariffs on South Africa will cost South Africa some 100,000 jobs. Now, 100,000 jobs lost is a lot for a country that's only growing at 1% per annum.
Yeah.
So how do we get that 1% per annum economic growth up to the 3 to 5% we need? Now, the easiest way to do it, and I disagree with him a lot, and I've told him that I disagree with him a lot, but sometimes I agree with Rob Hersov. Rob Hersov tells us that he can fix South Africa. I think he says he can fix it in a week. I'm not sure if he can actually fix it in a week, or if anybody can fix it in a week. It might take a bit longer than that. But essentially what Rob was saying is that come in and implement Javier Milei style privatization. Javier Milei is the president of Argentina. You privatize large parts of the economy and you bring in the private sector, as I said, making it feasible, attractive, rewardable for the private sector as well. And in the process, making sure that more people are employed, more people are upskilled, more people are learning. That's the answer.
Sure. We'll get to the energy and infrastructure crisis. South Africa remains to face load shedding, water shortages, and collapsing infrastructure. What practical reforms can be made to restore efficiency and reliability in these critical sectors?
Well, it would be wrong of me not to speak about energy and electricity without recognizing and commending the work of Minister Kgosientsho Ramokgopa, the Minister of Electricity. I was taken aback 2 years ago when President Ramaphosa said he's creating a portfolio called the Ministry of Electricity, but the minister has been doing a great job. I mean, we've gone some 10 or 11 months without load shedding, and so props must be given to the minister for that. But the energy sector, and we must be realistic about it, is far from where we'd want it to be. Infrastructure is far from where we'd want it to be. There's been a lack of maintenance on a number of power stations. We still are trotting the line between whether we want to move to renewable sources of energy or whether we are still relying and dependent on coal. These issues must be clarified. That's where a national dialogue comes in for the citizens themselves to say what they want the solution to be, because sometimes you have ministers who are not like Minister Ramokgopa. You have other ministers, and these ministers aren't as decisive and actionable as Minister Ramokgopa. And so it's necessary then for the citizens to come in and lend their voice to say what they want, what they think would be the best path for South Africa to move on, number one. Number two is this: how to fix all of these issues in South Africa. Infrastructure, energy, electricity, municipalities, by the way, who initiate something called load reduction. Load reduction is when municipalities owe Eskom money and they have to turn the lights off because they've got this massive debt that they pay to Eskom and therefore don't receive any electricity themselves and can't provide electricity to their constituents. How do we solve all of these problems? Political will. Political will. There must be more political will. And what I refer to by political will is that the willingness to want to solve these problems. Political servants, public servants these days, civil servants, occupy these positions with no real plan on how to solve problems, receive orders from the top down, do things in a very sort of complacent way where they just clock in and clock out. I don't think we're getting a return on investment for our civil servants in South Africa. I mean, if you look at our 2 trillion rand budget in South Africa, 700 billion rand goes towards paying public sector wages for all the nurses, policemen, municipal officials in South Africa. And I don't think we're getting a return on investment for that. And I think, yes, President Ramaphosa can inject as much money into these sectors that you mentioned, infrastructure and energy, as possible. The trillion rand budget line item that came from the 2025 budget to say he's going to invest 1 trillion rand in infrastructure is one thing. But without political will and competency and accountability, that 1 trillion rand will end up being the focal point of another Zondo commission. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, again, you've got to bring in the private sector. Who knows more about infrastructure and building than the private sector? And so Eskom, I think, and there's now talks and discussions about the unbundling of Eskom and making Eskom more competitive. I'm all for the privatization of Eskom. I think it would be great. And ideally in the world that I live, in this fantasy world that I'd like to see myself in, this South Africa that doesn't exist as yet, but I'd like to find ourselves in someday, is a South Africa where you have an energy sector that once again is able to provide energy to the rest of Africa an energy sector that has electricity companies, not just one state-owned monopoly called Eskom. You've got Telkom, and Telkom is horrible, but nobody uses Telkom because you've got Vodacom and MTN and Cell C, all private companies who are doing magnificently, with MTN now in the whole of Africa. So I'd like to see Eskom, yes, there perhaps, but not having a monopoly on the energy sector in South Africa. I'd like there to be, Siddharth's electricity company, Ismail's electricity company, not only because it would be more competitive, not only because the free market would then contain and control prices, so electricity would in fact become cheaper, not more expensive, but also because it really puts SOEs on their toes to say that because you don't have a monopoly, you now are forced to do things properly, otherwise you lose market share.
Yeah. All right. Getting to the corruption and accountability. Corruption has crippled development at every level. How can ethical leadership and citizen oversight be built into the national reform process?
It must start from within. It goes back to political will. But at the end of the day, when you speak about corruption in South Africa, let's talk about it like this. Let's lay out the answer like this. Corruption is a problem that affects every country on earth. It's a cancer, it's a disease that has left no piece of land on earth unscathed. Every country. The United States of America's got corruption. Apartheid South Africa had corruption. The UK's got corruption. And South Africa today has corruption. Africa in particular suffers from a problem of corruption. And why? And I don't think we really have the answer to why, aside from the opinion that we might have that some political parties that now rule these countries are in fact not political parties, are liberation movements masquerading as political parties. And so when faced with the massive task of governing a country and having at their disposal national coffers, treasuries at their disposal, that they're not able to implement successful economic systems. And so because of that, in any case, you have a crumbling economy, and then retreat and steal money for themselves, thinking that it's their time to eat. I think we've heard this mantra a lot. It's my time to eat. Yeah. Also, another threat of coalitions, by the way, I've just got to mention, is that the risk of having a revolving door, as we see in Johannesburg, when you have a mayor come in, for example, every 6 months or every 3 months, is that they don't come in with a long-term goal of fixing the city or fixing the country, but come in with the mentality of it's my time in the sun, it's my time to eat. So we've got to change that mentality. And again, we bring in the national dialogue. Hopefully the national dialogue can galvanize people towards one national agenda. But Siddharth, we've already got national agendas in South Africa. We've got a national development plan, 2030. We've got a number of other dialogues that we've had in the past. I mean, the Constitution of South Africa is the best blueprint for this. It's the culmination of the views of the whole of South Africa in one, not just legally binding document, but the supreme law of the land. This thing that we call the Constitution of South Africa. And here in the Constitution, in its founding values, you find the answer to your question. You need to have accountability, you need to have responsiveness, you need to have openness in the leaders, in the government, in the leaders that you have governing South Africa. You've also then got to look at the basic principles governing public service in South Africa as per Section 195 of the Constitution. Leaders must think about the people first, must become servant leaders rather than just thinking about themselves. And so all of that is not just only a legal requirement on them, but more so a cultural thing. It must be a mindset thing. It must be a political will thing. But if you are going to come in as a political leader who has the mindset that it's my time in the sun, you're going to end up with the problems that we have now. The other thing about it also is that I mentioned earlier this problem of criminal syndicates now controlling or alleged to be controlling large swaths of government, ministries, branches, police commissioners, and so forth. This makes me scared because you remember we had state capture. And during the state capture years, during the Gupta years, it was still corruption. It was corruption at a mass scale, but it was corruption in a velvet glove, right? And what I mean by that is that the Guptas were essentially businessmen who exploited and abused the state for their own malevolent gains, illegal gains. So they would offer bribes and kickbacks to presidents, ministers, heads of corporations in exchange for tenders, in exchange for preferential government contracts, and so on and so forth, and enrich themselves in that manner. So there's a paper trail, and eventually the whole thing blew, and people came before the Zondo Commission. Those recommendations have not been executed on yet. I mean, you still got people who are implicated in that Zondo Commission who now walk around. In fact, some of them find themselves as ministers of, as members of parliament. So that's a problem. So it's got to be actual action, and you'll see how my answer culminates in a minute. But now we've got criminal syndicates that seem to be controlling swaths of government. And this is not the velvet glove, as in the state capture Gupta years. This is something far worse. This is an iron fist, because it puts the very people who want to act out in a good-hearted way against corruption in danger. Look at what happened to Babita Deokaran, a whistleblower. Look at what happened to Kluta Murray, a whistleblower. You find that if you go against this corrupt system, you're killed, you're taken down. So finally, in culmination, let me say this. Firstly, you need better whistleblower protection. In fact, I am for rewarding whistleblowers so long as it's verifiable that their claims, they've got verifiable claims. It's the one thing. The second thing is that there must be examples made of those who are implicated in corruption. The fact that the Zondo Commission and its recommendations have not been acted upon is in my book, one of the major reasons why you now have a Madlanga Commission. If the Zondo Commission was taken with the seriousness that it deserves, if recommendations were implemented as strongly as they should have, if you found 10, 20, 30 people implicated in Zondo now sitting behind bars, serving sentences, then you wouldn't have Madlanga Commission. You wouldn't have Kat Matlala, Brown Mokhotsi, and others running around thinking that they control government.
All right. Getting to the crime and safety concerns, crime rates continue to rise, affect both business confidence and community morale. What systemic interventions do you believe can rebuild public safety and trust in law enforcement?
I don't think there's ever going to be as much trust in public law enforcement as there will be in the private sector. I think that police officers in South Africa have become very tainted as incompetent. It's not me that's saying that. Generally, the citizens of South Africa do believe that, police in South Africa are generally incompetent. And it's a sad thing, given that we pay 700 billion rands off of a 2 trillion rand budget to all public officials, and a chunk of that goes towards our police officers. So that's the one thing. Now, we've got to change that. There needs to be a better plan down from the Minister of Police or the Acting Minister of Police with targeted interventions to solve crime, recognizing, Siddharth, that crime is not uniform across South Africa. The type of crime that's witnessed in the Western Cape, the type of crime in Mitchell's Plain, the type of crime in Lavender Hills, the gangsterism, the scourge of drug dealers in those areas can't be compared to the crime that's happening in inner city Johannesburg, in Hillbrow with the hijacked buildings. Can't be compared, for instance, to the white-collar crime that happens in the boardrooms of companies, for instance, on the JSE. So there must be a number of targeted interventions for these crimes. I'm not one for commissions and so forth. There needs to be a direct emphasis on combating crime immediately and directly, is the one thing. The second thing about crime in South Africa is that crime is a socioeconomic problem, right? So crime doesn't just happen overnight. People don't just wake up and decide, I'm going to steal, rob, kill, murder, plunder. People are forced by and large to enter into petty crime because of the socioeconomic circumstances that they find themselves in. So that's got to change. So if you, for instance, Mitchell's Plain, as the Minister of Police, decide that what the police are going to do is to install more community centers in that community, sporting centers in that community, recreational activities, skills development facilities for kids to get off the streets and better their lives, perhaps develop a skill. that will land them in a good job later. Perhaps provide a facility for themselves to take care of themselves coming out of a household that's led by one parent. Unless you do that, the cycle will continue. And I think the third major intervention when it comes to crime, aside now that we've realized that crime is a socioeconomic problem, is that the best way to combat crime in South Africa is to get people into jobs. So it goes back to the economic questions that you asked me earlier. If we answer those economic questions and we get more people, especially more young people, into jobs, naturally and obviously you'll see a decline in crime in South Africa.
All right, let's get to the youth and education. With the ongoing education crisis and limited opportunities, how can young South Africans be empowered to participate in the nation's transformation?
Young people must realize that they have a voice that must be heard. The loudest voice, in fact, because young people make up the largest portion of our demographic. Most of the people in South Africa find themselves under 40 years old, or 18 to 35 years old is the definition of youth as per the National Youth Development Agency. So young people have within their hands the levers of power. It's how they pull it that will really affect what happens in South Africa. So when young people are complacent and tap out of the system and who lack political consciousness, as I said in my first answer, it's a huge problem for the whole of South Africa. It leads to people who won't be around in 20 and 30 years' time making decisions about people who will be in their prime in 20 and 30 years' time. That must be a realization. The second thing is that I have a theory that young people believe that they must be given everything from the government, that the job crisis in South Africa is government's fault, that the housing crisis is government's fault, that the government must give them access to education, higher education, tertiary education as well. This week marked 10 years since fees must fall. Now, they're not completely wrong, but they're not correct as well. I said I have a theory. My theory is that government cannot provide everything to all people and especially to young people. Perhaps it can provide education, but it cannot provide a job thereafter. Perhaps it can provide primary education, but it cannot provide the skills that are required for young people to go ahead and compete with the best in the world. Young people need to take control of that. Government must provide young people with the tools that they need to go and build for themselves. Now, government has failed in that. And when I say failed in that, I mean that, we have this dearth between, again, I mentioned our grade 4 learners in South Africa, grade 4 learners in America, who are now learning AI and digital skills and so forth. If young people in South Africa are given the tools they need, given the Wi-Fi they need, given the instruments that they need to go and build for themselves, then I believe young people are resilient enough to go and build for themselves. But there's also civic education that's needed. And I think NPOs and civil society must push harder at civic education. I think young people, firstly, don't understand about the Constitution. They don't know what the Constitution is. I think young people in South Africa don't know how to vote, don't know how their vote will impact the national vote. I think young people in South Africa also don't know how laws are being made, how they can publicly participate in the laws that are made. I think young people in South Africa really aren't as active as the youth of 1976 in going out and protesting for change. We see it once in a while, but on a day-to-day, we don't see it. So these are some of the things that must change. We need a more active, conscientized youth in South Africa.
All right. Getting into the climate and sustainability, as the effects of climate change intensify, how can South Africa balance economic growth with environmental responsibility in its national agenda?
Climate change is a fact of life, and we must get used to the fact that climate change is a fact of life. Now, that being said, when you talk about climate change and economic growth, it always becomes a sticky subject because it always goes to fossil fuels and renewable energy, and I'm certainly not an expert on the field. All I can say is that South Africa is a party to a number of international agreements, the Paris Climate Accord being one of them. South Africa must fulfill its obligations. South Africa must meet its strategic development goals. South Africa must align itself with countries who believe that climate change is a fact, as I said. And South Africa economically, domestically must make sure that we are not going contrary to those international agreements. If we said we're going to reduce our carbon footprint, then we ought to reduce our carbon footprint. Now, the president has something called the Presidential Climate Commission. I'm not exactly certain what they've been doing or whether their work has been impactful. It's perhaps a good thing that they exist to bring more awareness to the situation at hand. But again, as with the national dialogue, you can have the national dialogue and you can have the Presidential Climate Commission also housed at NEDLAC, but unless these dialogues and commissions result in actionable, executionable, implementable policies, you're not going to get anywhere. So I would like to see more climate-friendly legislation coming out of Parliament. I know that we've had a climate change bill last year, and that was a step in the right direction, but I'd like to see more positive climate legislation.
All right, before I get to my final question, are you okay if I ask you a question here from the comments?
Sorry?
I said, before I ask you my final question, are you okay if I give you a question here from the live comments?
Yes, please.
All right, this is actually a two-part question. This is from Jitin Rishika. The first part is, hi Ismail, thank you for an interesting pod, a long-awaited one. Not many would voice their opinions on the current political situation in South Africa, Thabo Mbeki being the last diligent leader of SA. And the second part is, right, here it is. Okay. With all the corruption and new discoveries recently, Tembisa Hospital saga, what's the way forward in repairing this fragmented and destroyed country?
I love the question. Thank you for the comment. Nobody has all the answers. I have suggestions on how we can go about it, though my suggestions might not be the most well received or even the most effective. South Africa, I think, needs, we've spoken about more effective leadership, but South Africa needs benevolent, and I'm very weary and cautious to say this because this is something that usually backfires politically, but I'm going to be brave enough to say it. South Africa needs something akin to benevolent dictatorship, something that was seen in Singapore with Lee Kuan Yew. I want to give you just a quick backstory there. You had Singapore, a small city island state that was a part of Malaysia, Malaya at the time, broke away, had no natural resources, was conquered, was, not independent, was initially colonized by the British, and who upon its independence decided that they need to utilize something from within to rebuild their country. It goes to the heart of your question. How do we repair this fragmented and destroyed country? South Africa has a lot of natural resources, right? Gold, copper, platinum, ore, minerals. But our best natural resource in South Africa is our people, the people of South Africa. I believe there's some tremendous people in South Africa, people who will not stand for South Africa to fall into the abyss, people who, by whatever means necessary, be it via a national dialogue or be it via speaking out as a whistleblower or calling politicians to account, will do whatever it takes to make sure that South Africa doesn't veer off the path to where it should be, a path of a better, brighter future. One of those people is General Mkhwanazi. People say that General Mkhwanazi initiated a national dialogue for 0 rands. It's true. What General Mkhwanazi did was to bring back into the spotlight ineffective leadership. Whether he's correct in his allegations or not is a matter that both you and I will have to wait and see, Siddharth. But at the end of the day, what General Mkhwanazi has done is he's spoken out on behalf of all the citizens of South Africa to say that we will not stand for corruption or tyranny in any form. So that's the one thing. Perhaps a more practical answer is what's the way forward in repairing this fragmented and destroyed country is that we cannot relegate our power to members of parliament or to political authorities. We must take things into our own hands. And I don't mean this in a revolutionary sense, but I mean that we all have a role and responsibility to play in protecting South Africa in whatever way we can, be it through charitable, philanthropic endeavors for those of us who are, economically blessed, for others to make sure that we have our voices heard, to go out and to conscientize others. But we all have a role to play in fixing South Africa.
All right. Getting to my final question. Lastly, in these difficult times, what message of unity, resilience, and hope would you share with South Africans who feel disillusioned about the country's future?
A lot of South Africans feel disillusioned about the country's future, but here's the thing: the message of hope is this: South Africa is not unfixable. South Africa can be fixed. South Africa will. South Africa must be fixed. It's the young people in South Africa who will have that burden, that responsibility of fixing South Africa. But Siddharth, believe me, I will not rest until my demographic, the young people in South Africa, are starting to fix South Africa. I've made it my life's duty, my life's goal, to do all that I can do in my personal capacity to conscientize young people to go out and fix South Africa, because I solemnly believe, and my message of hope is this, is that if we come together, if we are galvanized towards a good national agenda, a national agenda that doesn't relegate our rights and our responsibilities to members of parliament, but a national agenda that makes sure that we, the young people, are indeed the controllers of our future, then we come together and speak with one voice. We can fix South Africa.
All right.
My other,
Well, I
my other, my other message of hope is this. My message of hope is that I'm increasingly positive about the future of South Africa when I see people in South Africa doing tremendous things with very little at their disposal. I read stories every day of people who would be standing at the sidewalk asking for money, who somehow put themselves through university and today lead big companies. I read stories every day about people like Siya Kolisi, who don't come from the most prosperous background, but who sheer grit and hard work and will build themselves into the vision that they can be for the rest of South Africa. Those are isolated stories. There's one Siya Kolisi and there's one, person who built themselves from nothing to something. But we need to learn from those examples as young people in South Africa. And we need to be dynamic in how we approach the future of South Africa. Because at the end of the day, young people in South Africa are impressionable. We must be very wary about not creating demagogues of political leaders. The question mentioned Thabo Mbeki. Thabo Mbeki is a stellar political leader, a great political leader, somebody that I admire greatly, who I differ with politically in many ways, but who I, admire for his political will to still, even at 83 years old, want to solve South Africa. But even so, we must avoid making a demagogue or politically worshipping even Thabo Mbeki. We must be dynamic in this. We must look at leaders based on their competency, based on their merit. If leaders are competent today, let's give them our vote. If leaders are not competent tomorrow, let's not vote for them. And if there are no leaders in sight, let's put our hands up and say that we're willing to be the leaders for tomorrow.
All right. Well, I got to say thanks so much for your time, and hopefully we can catch up soon.
Thank you, Siddharth. It was really a pleasure speaking to you. I always enjoy speaking to you, and I'm so happy that today we had some comments from some of your guests as well. I'd like to invite you as well, Siddharth, to come and have a conversation with us at the F.W. de Klerk Foundation, to come to our studio at the foundation, speak to us. I'd like to hear your views on some of these pressing issues, because your voice matters just as much as mine's. You and I form that youth army that I spoke of, and so let's keep in touch.
Thanks, man.